In this part 2 of the analysis of the Tucker-Putin interview, we'll dive into the esoteric economic financial roots of the confrontation between the U.S. and Russia. The sinews of war are unlimited money, declared Cicero in his fifth Philippic, an observation echoed by Mary of Hungary, sister of Emperor Charles V, when she prophetically reminded him, "Your Majesty is the greatest prince in Christendom, but you cannot undertake a war in its name until you have the means to carry it through to victory." In fact, Mary's observation came true when, despite the seemingly unending river of gold and silver flowing to Spain from the New World, her nephew King Philip II failed to honor his debts 4 times during his reign. Obviously, while Rome and Spain could neither print money nor perpetually borrow with impunity, the lesson here is that there is indeed a limit to how much debt a government can accrue. The U.S. has not yet reached its limit. In today's world of fiat currencies, all economies are interrelated. The U.S. dollar, still by far the world's most widely accepted international medium of exchange, is, for better or worse, the foundation of this global house of cards. While it is in no one's interest to set off a chain of events that would cause the dollar's sudden collapse, neither is it realistic, as we enter a new multipolar world order, to assume that the dollar will perpetually remain as dominant as it was in the second half of the 20th century. Since 1971, a fiat dollar has been the linchpin of the global economy. In simple terms, the dollar is not backed by any commodity other than the good faith and credit of the United States government to pay all its debts, public and private, with, you guessed it, paper or electronic money. This privilege has allowed it to do what Rome and Spain couldn't, namely to literally create money from thin air and to incur perpetual fiscal and trade deficits without unleashing domestic hyperinflation. At issue, therefore, is whether this trend will be sustainable in the 21st century, and if it won't be, how and when will it impact our progeny? In 1958, the Bretton Woods Pact of 1944 was finally activated. Under its terms, the dollar was made directly convertible to gold at a fixed price, and all major currencies were pegged to the dollar. In 1971, as a result of high domestic inflation and interest rates stemming from excessive deficit spending in Vietnam and the Great Society, coupled with French President de Gaulle's policy of converting excess dollars into gold, President Nixon closed the convertibility window. Thus, at the stroke of a pen, he unilaterally ended Bretton Woods and made the dollar a fiat currency. Notwithstanding this Nixon shock, a subsequent agreement with Saudi Arabia to price oil exclusively in dollars, the size and stability of the U.S. economy, its openness to capital flows, respect for property rights, rule of law, and the depth and liquidity of its financial markets helped the dollar attain, and retain, the role of reserve currency of the world. But the new millennium ushered in a hitherto unforeseen challenge. BRICS saw the light of day. This association, originally organized by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has since expanded to Iran and others. One of its specific goals is to create a proprietary medium of exchange to bypass the dollar. While they have unresolved issues among them, such as the border dispute between China and India, they all object to America's policy of leveling sanctions on anyone, for any reason, and at any time. This is one challenge the U.S. has never had to contend with. Another is that China is an economic adversary unlike any it has ever faced. In 2014, its gross domestic product measured in terms of purchasing power parity surpassed the U.S. As of this writing, China's economy has grown to $17.52 trillion. And its population, larger than all of Europe and the Western Hemisphere combined, has more than 4 times as many domestic potential customers, scientists and engineers as the U.S. A disparity that is even more pronounced when measured on a per capita basis of native-born citizens. In addition, for better or worse, China's one-party form of government allows it to develop national strategies and deploy resources at will. So far, the result has been unprecedented and spectacular. Over the last 40 years, it lifted 800 million people from poverty and rose to an economic powerhouse. While that may not be a portent of things to come, It's not a stretch to anticipate that at some point this century Mandarin may well replace English as the world's dominant language in scientific publications. A factual examination of the esoteric condition of the American economy is in order. Specifically, we ask whether, why and how is it intrinsically dependent on pursuing NATO's expansion to the Russian border and denying the People's Republic of China to reabsorb Taiwan? America's perennial deficits and accumulated debt are beginning to become a matter of concern among some sophisticated investors. While the depth and liquidity of its financial markets remains healthy and robust, in 2000 the dollar comprised 71% of disclosed foreign reserves. By 2022 it had declined to 58%. That works out to 0.59% per year over 22 years. No one knows how this trend will evolve, but if it continues its downward curve at the same rate, by 2046 it would plunge to 45%. It's no secret that the quasi-bipolar Congress has not dealt with a long list of critical issues. The 2023 financial report of the U.S. government states, in part, the statement of long-term fiscal projections shows that the present value of total non-interest spending, over the next 75 years, under current policy, is projected to exceed the present value of total receipts by $73.2 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio was approximately 97% at the end of fiscal year 2023. Under current policy and based on this report's assumptions, it is projected to reach 531% by 2098. The projected continuous rise of the debt-to-GDP ratio indicates that current policy is unsustainable. The statement of social insurance shows that the present value of the government's expenditures for Social Security and Medicare Parts A, B and D, and other social insurance programs over the next 75 years is projected to exceed social insurance revenues by about $78.4 trillion. A $2.5 trillion increase over 2022 social insurance projections. Interest costs related to federal debt securities held by the public increased by $181.5 billion due largely to increases in outstanding debt held by the public and the average interest rates, which were offset by a decrease in inflation adjustments. Many commodities, including oil and gold, are priced in U.S. dollars. Therefore, should the dollar be deprived of its reserve status, the market would face increased volatility. As a result, commodity exporting countries might seek new currencies. That would accelerate the dollar's downward spiral. The de-dollarization drive currently underway could lead to a collapse of the dollar. If it does, imports would become more expensive and the government would be unable to borrow at current rates. In turn, that would result in a deficit that would need to be filled by increasing taxes or printing money, or both. Inflation would skyrocket, and the economy would collapse. A 2023 Redfin analysis found that, due primarily to a low supply, only 16% of homes for sale were affordable for a typical U.S. household, the lowest in at least a decade. A home is considered affordable if the estimated mortgage payment is no more than 30% of the average monthly income. In addition, white households could afford far more listings than Hispanic, and especially, Black households, who faced decades of housing discrimination. In fact, only 7% of listings were affordable for a typical Black household. Here it's worth noting that the definition of a typical household includes at least 2 working adults. Accordingly, first-time single buyers are worse off because typically their income does not equal or surpass the income of a typical household. The U.S. has not built enough new homes since 2008. That has created a deficit of millions of units that pushed up not only home prices but also rents. The gap in affordability is much worse for the lowest income households. This shortage is also the main driver of record U.S. homelessness rates. In fact, the Biden administration reported that more than 650,000 people slept outside or in shelters on a single night in January 2023, up 12% from the year before. The United States has greater wealth inequality than any other major developed nation, and Federal Reserve data show that the richest 1% of the population now own 54% of stock and mutual funds. At the other end of the wealth spectrum, a Bankrate survey revealed that 36% of U.S. adults have more credit card debt than emergency savings. Only 44% would pay an emergency expense of $1,000 or more from savings. 21% would finance with a credit card and pay it off over time, 10% would borrow from family or friends, and 4% would take out a personal loan. Artificial intelligence will affect almost 40% of jobs around the world. Among the worst afflicted in the U.S. will be self-employed people who have spent most of their working years in at-risk specialized fields such as loan and real estate agents, appraisers, insurance agents, web developers and others tasked with getting and analyzing information. They will be disproportionately impacted because, unlike regular employees, they usually do not qualify for state-funded unemployment insurance to mitigate their plight. Clearly, a new mechanism such as universal avatar income needs to be created to make sure they do not fall into the abyss of desperate activities detrimental to society or themselves. Two conflicting scenarios concerning the fate of the dollar come to mind. Case 1 assumes that the U.S. will stay the course and inevitably win another spectacular victory. Russia will lose the Ukrainian war, its economy will collapse, and it will explode into a number of impotent polities. With Russia out of the way, the BRICS challenge will come to a screeching halt and China and Iran will be contained, sterilized and quarantined. Russia, the largest country in the world by area but with a density of just 9 persons per square kilometer, considers this brightest of red lines the ultimate existential threat. And it is determined to neutralize it. Case 2 assumes that despite the US and NATO's best efforts, Russia will have its way in Ukraine and BRICS will mushroom into a multitude of countries at least as numerous as, and wealthier than the US and its allies. Absent unforeseen complications such as a war between China and India, the consequences for the US and NATO could range from a relatively innocuous loss of prestige to complete collapse of their economies. For them, that is their equivalent red line. Ominously then, both the US and Russia consider their conflicting red lines non-negotiable. The danger of direct war between the two is exacerbated and magnified by a dynamic and unpredictable factor. Namely the mutually repulsive animosity between their current top leaders and some of the closest members of their respective confidants. That was not the case during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis between President John Kennedy and Chairman Nikita Khrushchev, and they found a way to avoid mutual annihilation. In view of all this, it's absolutely imperative to develop a feasible and peaceful fallback plan to render both cases moot and inert while there's still time. However, despite the upcoming presidential and congressional elections in November 2024, neither mainstream media nor the candidates have acknowledged, much less debated, these issues. Instead, they distract the electorate with other themes, which, while important to some segments of the electorate, do nothing to avert economic ruin or annihilation, or both. In Part 3 of this series we'll examine a specific feasible plan to preserve the dollar's value and avoid a terminal war.